Welcome to today's episode of Alternative History. Today we're going to ask the question, if 9/11 hadn't happened, and if America had managed to stop the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York, how would the world be different now, today? On the 11th of September 2001, a great tragedy occurred. Two planes were flown into the World Trade Center in New York by terrorists. The terrorists hijacked the planes and then flew them on purpose into the towers, into the World Trade Center. A total of 4 planes were hijacked, but only 3 managed to hit their targets. With the 4th plane, the passengers and the crew members managed to overpower the terrorists, and that plane ended up crashing into a field in the countryside somewhere. The 9/11 attacks were an event that changed the course of human history, and it caused cascading effects for the following 20 years and even until today. But imagine that America had managed to stop these 9/11 attacks. Imagine that these 9/11 terrorist attacks had never actually happened. I wonder how the world would be different today if those attacks hadn't happened. Well, the first thing that I think would be different is that there would have been less wars in the Middle East. Following the attacks of 9/11, the American government went to war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was the 9/11 attacks that were used as a justification to go into war in these countries. At the onset of these 2 wars, the American public were very much in support of them, mostly because of the 9/11 terrorist attacks that had recently happened back then. However, if those 9/11 attacks had been stopped by the American government, and if those 9/11 attacks hadn't happened in the first place, then I think the American public would have been a lot more reluctant to go to war in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and it would have been much more difficult for the US government to try and persuade the American public to be on board with those 2 wars. The core reason why the American public were on board with the wars, at least at the onset of those wars, was because of the 9/11 attacks. It's very possible that if those 9/11 attacks hadn't happened, then there would not have been any wars in the Middle East. There would not have been a war in Afghanistan, and there wouldn't have been a war in Iraq. It's very possible that if the 9/11 attacks hadn't happened, that those wars also would not have ever happened. Another big change that occurred after the events of 9/11 was that airport security and security in general became much stronger and much stricter. Suddenly, we all began to see that at airports there was a lot more security, a lot more scanning of people's bodies, and a lot more metal detectors and things like that that you had to walk through. However, if the attacks of 9/11 had not happened, if the American government had managed to stop these 9/11 attacks, then perhaps we would not have so much airport security today, because it really was the 9/11 attacks that really encouraged airports around the world to ramp up their security. Perhaps if those 9/11 attacks hadn't happened, we would have less airport security today. Maybe the airport security would be a lot less strict than it is now if those 9/11 attacks hadn't happened. The third and final change that really happened after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 is that, generally speaking, governments around the world, but particularly in the USA and a little bit in the UK, began to surveil their citizens a lot more closely. You see, because of the ongoing threat of terrorism, the US government and other governments started doing more surveillance on people, investigating people, and so on. And of course, nowadays, it's fairly common knowledge that the government probably could track you if they wanted to find out who you were, where you were going, and they probably would be able to do that. But it is possible that if the terrorist attacks of 9/11 had not happened, then governments would not have increased their surveillance capabilities to such an extent. It's very possible that without these terrorist attacks, they would have never sort of felt the need to increase their surveillance to such an extent. And perhaps now, if those terrorist attacks had not happened before, perhaps now we would not be under such surveillance as we are now. Perhaps the government would not be tracking us and, following us and watching what we're doing quite as much if those terrorist attacks hadn't happened. Thank you for watching this episode of Alternative History. I hope you found it interesting, and I will see you in the next video.